we have 6 modules in the program, and each of the modules will have a variable number of lessons. The first one being Introduction to Disaster Risk Management. So we are coming back to that because it's within that framework. We use that framework that is there and we build it, but then we want to end up with how do we build resilience for reduction of risk. All right? And so that's where we can build the resilience. So if something were to happen or there were a disaster to occur, we are more prepared. Now, so that the first lesson therefore would be understanding risks, hazards, vulnerability, and disasters. So we're looking at those in terms of the definitions, but the definitions go beyond just what it describes. It's not so much of a description, it's the nature and purpose of the lesson. But by doing this, we will build foundational knowledge to understand the nature of this before we get to the point of risk mapping and the other parts of the program. Then the second lesson would be emergency, crisis, and disaster, the nature of that. You know, the dynamic of it. Sometimes, you know, I remember a professor told me that they call something, they would define something as a riot on the news. I'm not knocking the news here, right? I'm here with you. And when they analyzed it, they say it was not defined properly. It wasn't a riot. And so they defined it differently. It depends on your perspective of it.
It was just a squabble.
Something like that.
So it's how you're viewing it.
So we need to examine the nature of risks and vulnerability and hazards and disasters themselves. And we need to look at that comprehensively and examine that from different perspectives. Who is the audience? Who is the one that is being affected, and how do they perceive this?
Yes.
All right, and that's why I mentioned earlier varying vulnerabilities, variability in that, because different people are affected differently and they view things differently. All right, so we need to take all interests and viewpoints into consideration. And then we get more into the material. So we look at lesson 2, emergency, crisis, and disaster. Then we need to look at the causes and effects. Because sometimes why we don't know about the causes? We just want to know about the effects because that's what affects us. Maybe that's for somebody else to deal with. You know, sometimes we often say when we don't know how to deal with something or something becomes overwhelming, that's government's responsibility. But guess what? It's all of our responsibility.
Yeah, we pass the buck.
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah, and that put pressure on the very system of which we are a part.
Yes.
All right. So we don't know causes and effects of that. And this is where the science of it comes in. But we want to get now to translate that science into reality for us. Science is reality, but it's abstract. And we want to make that knowledge accessible in terms of how it's understood. Then we need to look at models of disaster management. Now people say, hey, that's a lot of theory. But you see, theory is very important. From a practical point of view, from the layman's point of view, excuse the term, they would say that, oh, that's theory, and we dismiss that. And that this person is very bookish and theoretical, but really is only the practical knowledge you need. The problem with that is that you can have the facts, but don't understand what's going on. What you see is what you see. And they say these facts speak for themselves, but we don't understand what's going on, the system within which that is a part of. And so we need theory to explain that. All right? So even when you have all the theories, you still have all the facts, you have to put it into the theory. And that's what gives the facts meaning. And so
it depends sometimes on the approach.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can move from theory. You can apply theory, which is, more of an inductive approach.
Yes.
And then you can look at the deductive approach. You can start with the experiment and move towards developing the theory.
Yeah. It's an iterative process.
It is.
Because sometimes you can have a theory, we call a grounded theory, based on what the facts are. So you start from there. Regardless of where you start from, you need to put them together.
Yes.
All right? And for them to it's a dichotomy, but it's not really, it should not be a dichotomy, it's one thing.
Yes.
theory and practice should go together. You don't even need a comma in there.
They are not separate.
They're not separate. It's one thing. So the iterative process, and so that's the way we need to think, because that's what actually how it occurs in reality. All right. So we want to be close to that. Not that we understand all of this fully. I don't claim to understand all of this. Hey, what I know, I'm going to work with what I know, and I'm still learning, because knowledge is about learning. We don't say teaching. We say teaching and learning. They go hand in hand. It's the same thing. It's one thing.
Yes.
All right. So that's that. Now, then we look at models of disaster management, because based on experiences, we have lessons that we have learned. Are we not going to learn from our lessons? If we don't want to learn from our lessons, hey, let's not take any lesson. The lesson will teach us anyway. All right? We're going to feel the impact of that. But you see, we build frameworks and theories, models, and these things are developed over time based on experiences. And we try to work with the knowledge base on that and work that together. So we try to come up with a model. Model is no different than a theory. All right? And we utilize that because it's been tested too. We call it proof of concept. All right? We test it, and so there are models that we will use. Now, the one that we want to use, that we have to use, because it's the mandate, through the Caribbean, the CARICOM countries, and also the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, the major source of funding, and there are other sources as well, that we use the SEDIMA framework, Caribbean Emergency and Disaster Management Agency. So it comes from there. And but you see, they align with international counterparts, and so there are international conventions from wider experience, because not what happens here in the region, there is influence from the outside, and vice versa. That what happens here affects other. It's one world, one Earth. All right. So there's that collaboration. And so that has its source in what we'll call the Sendai Framework. All right? The Sendai Framework was out of Japan, but it covered a wide jurisdiction internationally. So the source of that comes from there. And there was the Hyogo Framework, which through international conventions, that's where the source of this knowledge, building knowledge and building the models. So that's what we're going to talk about there. So it's a theoretical foundation, a knowledge base. So let's say the word knowledge base, before we get into the stuff.
Could you explain, because sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, the difference between a hazard and a disaster? Sometimes people use them interchangeably, but they're not the same thing.
Hazards are always there. They're always there. Whether it's a steep slope, with the potential of producing rockfalls, landslides. The volcano is there. The mountain, the formation is there. We have, we can potentially have seismic activities, but the fault lines are there. Those are hazards.
So you're talking about potential disasters, in a certain sense.
It has a potential.
It has a potential to be a disaster.
But don't forget, those are natural. Our communities itself, there are risks of living in a community, and that's why we need organization. We need governance and management. We need to organize ourselves in governments and society and agencies, community-based organizations, etc.
For example, one of the big risks we have right now is the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I figure you will definitely ask about that.
It is a risk.
Well, right now it's
more than a risk. It's a disaster. It's a disaster.
But the risk was there. The hazard was already there. Potentially, it could have been something else. Maybe not COVID-19, but COVID-16 or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we could have had any other kind of outbreak. We could have an epidemic, which is national, you know, that sort of thing. But a pandemic.
But most of the world was not prepared for it.
But wasn't there already a hazard when we have the movement of people, the movement of materials, the movement of other organisms, all right, trade, all that stuff? Wasn't that potential already there? Isn't that potential already there we have systems, weather systems, transporting dust from elsewhere. For every speck of raindrop, there's a nucleus of dust. Potentially, because of the nature of the natural environment and our own human-created environment, there are risks, there are hazards waiting to happen. Now, when you get an event, when something happens, it can be a disaster. But something can happen here, something can happen there. There's something very similar. But because they are hazards, but because the people who are affected are prepared differently,
the impact is different.
Impacted differently. Because they prepare differently, they could be impacted differently. And that's where the vulnerability comes in. Your vulnerability may be less than mine. But even within that jurisdiction, you can have certain segments of your society can be affected more than others. So for some, it's a disaster. For others, maybe they can benefit from it in some other ways. So we need to look at these things. And hazard is always there. We have many of them, natural and man-made, excuse the term, but human created, that present this risk to us that can eventually end up in a disaster.
Yes.
All right. So we need to understand this, and that's what this program will help to do.